The auctioneer's voice was a hammer blow in the dry air, sharp and final. 13 years old, they said. Strong enough for field work, maybe a little cooking. Property. The word hit June like a physical force. She stood on the platform, sun hot on the back of her neck, dust coating her tongue. Below, faces blurred, men in stained coats, women in bonnets tight with judgment. A sudden, desperate impulse seized her. Not thought, just raw animal need. She moved before they could call the final bid. Scrambled down the rickety steps, legs pumping, skirt snagging on splintered wood. The crowd gasped, then roared its disapproval. Stop her! Voices yelled, hands reached clumsy and slow. June didn't look back. She ran past the dusty canvas tents, towards the edge of the dying town, towards the empty land. Her lungs burned, each breath a ragged tear. This wasn't running to something. This was running from the hammer blow, from the word, from the faces. Then a shadow fell across her path. Not a building, but a horse, big and dark. Mounted on it was a man. He wasn't blocking her with intent. He just was there, a still point in the chaos. His rifle was strapped, worn leather against worn saddle. His eyes, under the brim of his wide-brimmed hat, were the color of ash, hollowed out, like everything inside had already burned away. Eli Boone. He hadn't come for the auction. He'd come for feed, maybe, or just to watch the world die a little slower. His presence was a wall she crashed into, breathless and desperate. The noise of the town receded, replaced by the pounding of her own heart and the silent gaze of the man on the horse. The dust settled around her, thick as a shroud. She halted inches from the horse's powerful legs, chest heaving, the taste of fear and dirt in her mouth. Her eyes, wide and pleading, fixed on the man's face. There were flecks of blood on her cheek where a thorny bush had scratched her escape. Dust coated her thin dress, turning it the color of the parched earth. Every part of her screamed, but no sound came out. She was a trapped animal, cornered between the silent man and the rising tide of angry voices behind her. Eli Boone didn't move. His horse shifted slightly, a soft huff of air. Eli's gaze didn't waver from the girl's face. He saw the terror there, raw and undisguised. He also saw something else, a spark, a defiance that hadn't been beaten out yet. It was a spark he hadn't seen in years, a spark his wife had carried, right up until the end. The auctioneers and a few townsfolk spilled from the cluster of tents, shouting, waving their arms. They were closing in, a pack eager to reclaim their property. The auctioneer, a fleshy man with a voice like scraping wood, stepped forward. "Boone, get that girl out the way, she's ours." The man's tone was sharp, demanding. Eli didn't respond immediately. He looked past the girl at the approaching group, hard faces, greedy eyes. He looked back at the girl, at the plea in her eyes that mirrored a memory he tried to keep buried. He felt the weight of the rifle on his saddle, the familiar comfort of the worn wood stock. He took a slow breath, the dust filling his lungs. The shouting grew louder. He knew what they saw, runaway property, a few dollars about to vanish. He knew what he saw, a reflection, a choice. He shifted slightly in the saddle, his hand not quite touching the rifle but close enough. He spoke, his voice low and rough, barely audible over the rising clamor. "Just one thing, she's with me." The words hung in the air, thick with challenge. The approaching men skidded to a halt. They looked at the girl, then at Eli Boone, then back at each other. Everyone in this territory knew Eli Boone, knew about the fire, knew about his wife. Knew he wasn't a man to be trifled with, not anymore. Not unless you were ready for the consequence. The standoff solidified, silent and tense, under the indifferent western sun. The ride back to the ranch was silent. June sat stiffly on the horse behind Eli, her small hands gripping his worn leather belt. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in hues of blood and fire. The silence wasn't comfortable, it was charged, heavy with unspoken questions and unknown futures. The ranch was isolated, nestled in a shallow valley, the house a single, stoic structure of wood and stone against the vast, indifferent landscape. It looked as hollowed out as the man who owned it. Inside, the air was cool and smelled of dust and old wood smoke. Eli didn't light a lamp immediately. He moved through the dim light, his movements economical and practiced. He motioned towards a worn cot near the cold hearth. "You sleep there." Then he went to a small, locked wooden box on a shelf. He opened it with a key he kept on a leather thong around his neck. Inside, nestled in faded velvet, was a revolver. It was well maintained. The metal gleamed dull but clean. Not ornate but reliable. A woman's hand had held it, polished it, relied on it. He turned, the gun heavy in his palm. He held it out to June. Her eyes widened, reflecting the dim light. She hesitated, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for it. The cold metal felt strange, powerful, alien. It was heavier than she expected. "You run again," Eli said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "You take this." He didn't say if you run, he said you run. It wasn't permission, not exactly. It was acknowledgement, an understanding of her desperate instinct. "It's loaded." He didn't add a threat. He didn't say he'd come after her, he just stated a fact. The gun in her hand was a choice. It was a responsibility. It was a burden, maybe, or a lifeline. It wasn't a test of loyalty to him. It was a test of her own will to survive. The gesture, stark and simple, felt monumental. A man who had lost everything was putting the means of life or death into the hands of a girl he didn't know. A girl who was legally owned by another. It wasn't a threat. It was a gesture of trust, raw and unsolicited. He turned away then, leaving her standing there in the growing darkness, the weight of the revolver anchoring her to the spot. Night fell, bringing with it the vast, indifferent quiet of the prairie. The only sounds were the settling of the old house, the distant cry of a coyote, and the soft crackle of the small fire Eli finally built in the hearth. He cooked salted pork and beans, sharing the meager meal without a word. June ate slowly, cautiously, eyes never leaving the plate. She didn't speak. He didn't either. Silence seemed to be the language they both understood, a buffer against the overwhelming events of the day. He didn't ask her name. Didn't ask where she came from, who she ran from, why she was at that auction. It was a deliberate omission. Questions felt like hooks, pulling her story out piece by piece, demanding something she might not be ready to give, or demanding something he wasn't ready to hear. He just let the silence sit between them, heavy and unspoken. She didn't offer anything either. Her face was a mask of cautious neutrality. When they finished eating, Eli banked the fire and spread a thin blanket over the cot for her. She lay down, not removing her dusty clothes. The revolver lay on the floor beside the cot within easy reach. It was a dark shape against the dull wood. She didn't touch it, but her eyes occasionally flickered towards it. It was there, a silent promise, a silent wait. Sleep didn't come easy. Every creak of the house, every gust of wind against the glassless window frame was a potential threat. She listened, her body tense, the cold metal of the revolver a physical anchor to her strange new reality. Eli slept on the floor near the doorway, his rifle within arm's reach. His breathing was slow and steady, a low rumble in the dark. But even in sleep, there was a tension in his posture, a readiness that spoke of a life lived on alert. The house held its breath around them. A broken man, a runaway girl, and a dead woman's gun waiting in the quiet dark. No questions asked, no names given, just the silence and the waiting. The next few days settled into a routine dictated by the needs of the ranch and the vast, quiet emptiness. Eli fixed fences broken by time and weather. June followed him sometimes, trailing a few paces behind, watching him work. He didn't tell her to help. He didn't tell her not to. She just watched. He hammered the posts with steady, powerful strokes. Each thud of the hammer seemed to echo the finality of the auctioneer's gavel. Only this time, the sound was about building, about holding something together. June watched, her small face serious, her hands often clutched together. It felt like he was hammering away the fear inside her, each strike a blow against the invisible chains that had bound her. While mending a section of fence near the northern ridge, Eli paused. He wasn't just looking at the weathered wood. He was looking at the land beyond, at the subtle shifts in the terrain. He knelt, pretending to check a loose wire, his eyes scanning. There, a faint disturbance in the dust near the scattered rocks. Not animal tracks, boot prints, partial, as if someone had been trying to hide their passage. They led towards the ranch, then curved away. Someone had been watching. Not recently, perhaps, but within the last day or two. A cold, familiar knot tightened in his gut. He finished the fence section, his movements deliberate, betraying nothing. He glanced back at the house. June was sitting on the porch, a small, still figure. Was she watching him? Was she watching the land? He couldn't tell. She had learned to be watchful, that was clear enough. He walked back towards the house, the quiet landscape suddenly feeling less empty, more populated by unseen eyes. He looked at the house, then at the fence, then at the girl on the porch. Building fences wasn't just about keeping livestock in. It was about keeping other things out. Things that followed runaways. Things that saw property where he saw something else. The boot prints were a promise, a threat. He knew they wouldn't leave her alone, and now they knew where she was. The silence of the ranch suddenly felt fragile. Eli baked bread. It wasn't fancy, just flour and water and sourdough starter he'd kept alive for years. It was lumpy, rustic, but it was warm and smelled real. He tore off a hunk and placed it on a tin plate before June. It was the first warm meal he'd cooked that wasn't just beans or salted meat. Something fresh. Something requiring a little care. She looked at the bread, then at him. Her eyes were wary, like a wild bird contemplating a hand holding out seed. Months, he figured, of being given scraps or nothing at all. Of food as a means of control, not sustenance. She hesitated, her small hand hovering above the plate. It was a simple thing, a piece of bread. But the hesitation spoke volumes. It spoke of hunger, yes, but also of deep-seated distrust, of expecting conditions or consequences attached to even the most basic human kindness. Finally, slowly, she reached out and broke off a small piece. She brought it to her mouth, chewing deliberately as if savoring each crumb. Her eyes closed for a brief moment. When she opened them, something in the wariness had softened, just a fraction. She swallowed, her throat working visibly. She looked at Eli, really looked at him for the first time without pure terror or blankness. And then she spoke. 2 simple words, soft, barely audible in the quiet room. "Thank you." The words hit Eli with the force of a physical blow. He flinched internally, a muscle near his eye twitching, not from her, never from her, but from the memory the simple phrase unlocked. A different voice, long silent, saying those same words over a shared meal. It was the sound of gratitude, of unexpected connection, of a brittle hope. It was a sound he hadn't heard directed at him since the fire. He swallowed hard, clearing the sudden tightness in his own throat. He didn't look at her, just nodded curtly and tore off a piece of bread for himself, the rough crust suddenly tasting of ash. The silence returned, but now it felt different, warmer, and heavier. June's clothes were ragged, thin cotton stained with dirt and wear. One afternoon, while she was washing herself carefully in a basin of water Eli had heated, she shifted, and the neckline of her dress slipped. Eli wasn't looking directly at her, he was chopping wood outside, but he caught the movement from the corner of his eye. He stopped, axe halfway down. On the curve of her left shoulder, just below the collarbone, was a mark. Not a scar from an injury, but a brand. Small, cruel, unmistakable. It was shaped like a stylized flame, like a lick of fire. The ash brand. He'd heard of it. It was the mark of Calvin Thornton's property. Thornton, the man who owned the auction, the sheriff's brother. The knowledge settled cold and heavy in his gut. She hadn't just been sold by Thornton. She had belonged to him, property, branded like livestock. He lowered the axe slowly. The sound of it hitting the chopping block felt unnaturally loud in the sudden quiet. He didn't go inside. He didn't ask her about it. He just stood there looking at the piece of wood, seeing the shape of a flame burned into a child's flesh. It explained the look in her eyes, the way she flinched at sudden movements, the deep reservoir of fear hidden beneath her quiet facade. It explained the name Ash sometimes whispered about runaway girls. Later, when she was dressed and sitting by the fire, tracing patterns in the dirt with her finger, Eli spoke. His voice was low, rougher than usual. "That mark." June froze. Her finger stopped tracing. She didn't look up. For a long moment she was utterly still, like a statue carved from stone and fear. Eli didn't press, he just waited. The silence stretched, tense and fragile. Finally she spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, flat and devoid of emotion, as if stating a simple fact about the weather. She didn't offer details, she didn't offer pain, she just offered ownership. One stark, brutal sentence. I belong to him. She didn't elaborate, he didn't need her to. The words, they painted a picture clearer and more horrifying than any detailed account could have. He looked at the fire, watching the flames lick at the dry wood. He saw the brand on her shoulder. He saw the fire that took his wife. He saw the man named Thornton. The knot in his gut tightened further. Belonged to him. Not anymore. Not if Eli Boone had anything to say about it. The decision to go to town wasn't easy. It was a risk, a deliberate step out of the relative safety of the isolated ranch and back into the eyes of the world that considered June property. But she needed clothes, supplies, maybe even boots that fit. More importantly, Eli felt a grim necessity to face the system head-on, to see their reaction, to make a statement. He loaded the wagon, hitched the horse, and June climbed in, sitting small and quiet on the wooden seat beside him. She held the revolver under the thin blanket on her lap. The general store was the center of town life, a cluttered space smelling of dry goods, leather, and stale coffee. When they walked in, the hum of conversation died. Heads turned. Eyes, sharp and assessing, fixed on June. Whispers started, low and quick, like dry leaves skittering across dusty ground. "That's the girl," he heard one woman murmur behind her hand. "The runaway from the auction." "Boone's got her," a man muttered, his gaze hard on Eli. Eli ignored them, moving with deliberate slowness towards the counter. June stayed close, a small shadow clinging to his side. She kept her head down, but Eli could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were clenched. The store owner, a thin man named Mr. Gable, whose face was usually wreathed in polite smiles, greeted Eli with tight lips and cautious eyes. He eyed June with open suspicion. "Eli," Gable said, his voice cool. "Didn't expect to see you in with company." "Need supplies, Gable," Eli replied, his voice level. He picked up a sack of flour, forcing a semblance of normalcy. The whispers continued, growing bolder. Eli heard Thornton's name, the sheriff's name. It was clear. The man she belonged to wasn't some anonymous, distant owner. He was the man with the most power in this valley. The law. June flinched visibly when a woman behind them spoke louder. "Seems like some folks got short memories about what belongs where." Eli put the flour down. He turned slowly, his gaze sweeping across the faces in the store. The eyes dropped one by one. He didn't say anything. His silence was colder, harder than any threat. He bought the supplies he needed, his movements slow and precise. He paid Gable, the transaction feeling more like a challenge than a purchase. June followed him back to the wagon, the weight of all those staring eyes heavy on her small back. The ride back to the ranch felt different. The isolation of the ranch now felt less like a haven and more like a target. Everyone knew, and the law wasn't on Eli's side. Next stop in town was the county clerk's office. A small, dusty room smelling of old paper and ink. Eli knew it was likely a futile gesture, but something stubborn inside him demanded it. He had a notion of fragile, desperate hope that paperwork, official records, might offer some kind of shield. He approached the clerk, a stout man with ink stains on his fingers and a permanent frown. "Want a file for guardianship," Eli stated, pushing his hat back slightly. The clerk looked up, blinked. Then his eyes went to June, who stood slightly behind Eli, her presence a silent question mark. His frown deepened. "Guardianship," he scoffed, leaning back in his chair. He tapped a finger on a large, leather-bound ledger open before him. "Over what?" Eli felt his jaw tighten. "Over the girl." The clerk's mouth stretched into a humorless grin. He chuckled, a dry, rustling sound like brittle paper. "Mr. Boone, that girl is listed right here." He pointed to a line in the ledger. Eli leaned forward, reading the spidery script. "One female minor approx. 13 ers. Auction property of Calvin Thornton." Below it was a brief note: "Runaway, retrieval in progress." The clerk tapped the ledger again, louder this time. "She's auction property. You can't file for guardianship over property. You'd have to buy her. And I hear Mr. Thornton ain't selling. Not to you anyway." He smirked, clearly enjoying the moment. Eli looked at the ledger, at the line reducing June to an entry, a commodity. He looked at the clerk's smirking face, the embodiment of the system that saw humans as chattel. The anger that simmered beneath his surface threatened to boil over, but he held it in. He picked up the pen sitting in an inkwell on the desk. He didn't ask permission. He found a blank space on the page near the entry about June. He dipped the pen and in his own rough hand wrote 3 words, "In the care of Eli Boone." He signed his name beneath it, clear and deliberate. He put the pen down. He looked the clerk square in the eye. "Then I guess," Eli said, his voice low but carrying the weight of finality, "I'm stealing her properly." He turned and walked out, June close behind him. The clerk sputtered behind them, outraged. The ledger remained open, the new entry a small, defiant mark against the official record of ownership. It was just ink on paper, but it felt like drawing a line in the dust, a line he knew he couldn't uncross. The nights at the ranch remained quiet, punctuated only by the wind and the settling sounds of the house. June still slept on the cot by the hearth, the revolver within reach. Eli slept by the door, listening. One night, long after the fire had died to embers and the moon cast long, eerie shadows, a noise broke the silence. A scrape against the outer wall, then another. Slow, deliberate, not the wind, not an animal. June was instantly awake. Her eyes were wide in the darkness. She didn't cry out, didn't flinch. She reached for the revolver. Her hand closed around the grip, steady despite the tremor that ran through her small body. Eli was awake too, a silent presence in the dark room. He didn't move, didn't tell her what to do. This was her choice, her reaction. The scraping sound came again, closer to the window. June raised the revolver. Her breathing was shallow, held tight in her chest. She pointed it towards the window frame, a dark rectangle against the slightly less dark wall. She didn't aim to kill, just to make noise, to show she was armed, to show they were ready. She squeezed the trigger. The shot ripped through the quiet house, deafeningly loud. A flash of muzzle fire lit the room for a split second. Glass shattered from the window pane. The scraping sounds outside stopped abruptly. Then came the sound of hurried footsteps retreating into the night. Silence descended again, heavier now, vibrating with adrenaline and fear. June lowered the revolver slowly. It felt hot in her hand. Eli didn't move from the doorway. He just listened. Listened to the sounds fade into the distance. Listened to June's ragged breathing. He waited a few minutes, letting the silence settle back in, making sure the threat was gone for now. In the morning, while June was still asleep, curled tight on the cot, Eli went outside. The sun was just beginning to climb over the ridge. He walked to where June had fired, the broken window, splintered wood, and in the dust near the wall, unmistakable boot prints. Not just one set, but 2. They weren't coyote tracks. They were human. 2 men, watching, waiting. And now they knew the girl had a gun. Eli looked at the tracks, then back at the house, at the broken window. They hadn't just been scouting. They'd been testing the defenses. And now they had their answer. The shooting incident seemed to break something loose in June. The silence that had cloaked her like a second skin began to fray. She still wasn't talkative, but small pieces of her story started to emerge, sometimes in hesitant bursts, sometimes woven into seemingly unrelated observations. It started the next morning as Eli was patching the broken window. She sat nearby, watching him work. "That was loud," she said, her voice small. Eli grunted in agreement, fitting a piece of wood into the frame. "I used to get beat for making noise," she continued, almost to herself, "especially at night." Eli stopped hammering, holding the nail in place. He waited. "Ran away before," she murmured, tracing the rough wood of the wall. "Twice. They caught me both times." Her voice was flat, stating facts without asking for pity. "The first time they said I wasn't worth chasing. That was when he marked me so everyone would know." She touched her shoulder lightly where the ash brand lay hidden under her dress. "The second time they broke my arm." She didn't look at him when she said it, just stared at the wall. Eli finally hammered the nail home. The sound was sharp and final. He didn't say he was sorry, didn't say it wasn't fair. There was no point in such words. He just kept working, the rhythm of his movements steady and grounding. Later, while they were eating the midday meal, she looked at the revolver sitting on the shelf. "Nobody ever gave me a gun before," she said quietly. "Said I couldn't be trusted." She paused, considering the metal object. Couldn't be trusted with anything, not even words, really. Illy looked at her then. At the small, fierce face, the eyes that had seen too much. He saw the truth in her words. She hadn't just been denied freedom, she had been denied agency, denied a voice, denied the means to protect herself. The revolver wasn't just a weapon, it was a symbol of trust given where none had ever existed, a symbol of permission to be capable. Then out of the blue she spoke her name. "It's June." Illy nodded slowly. "Illy." It was a quiet exchange, simple names spoken in a quiet house, but it felt monumental. A name wasn't just a label, it was an identity. And by giving him hers and by asking for his, she was forging a connection, building something fragile and new in the wreckage of her past. She had been trusted with a weapon, and now she was trusting him with her name and with words. The truth was spilling out, slow and hesitant, filling the quiet spaces between them. Smoke on the horizon. A thin, dark line smudging the sharp blue western sky. Ellie saw it first, his eyes scanning the land with practiced vigilance. He stopped what he was doing, mending tack, and stared. June came out of the house, following his gaze. She saw it too. "What is that?" she asked, her voice small. "Smoke," Illy replied, stating the obvious, but his tone held something else. Recognition, foreboding. It was coming from the direction of the Smith homestead, a small place about half a day's ride south. He knew the Smiths, quiet folks, kept to themselves, and he knew something else about them. They had taken in a young girl, a relative, a few months ago. A girl who, rumors had it, had been orphaned by some trouble further south. A girl who hadn't shown up at the auction. Ellie watched the smoke column grow thicker, darker. It wasn't just a cooking fire. It was a fire out of control, a house burning, a homestead disappearing into ash. It was a message, sent across the miles, etched in smoke against the sky. They weren't just looking for June. They were punishing anyone who interfered, anyone who dared to harbor property that wasn't theirs. The Smiths, quiet and harmless, had become an example. June stood beside him, her small hand clutching his sleeve. She didn't need him to explain. She understood the message. The smoke wasn't just from a fire, it was from a warning, a brutal, undeniable declaration of intent. They were coming for her, and they would burn anyone who stood in their way. The isolation of the ranch, the quiet peace they had found, felt terribly fragile now. The world, with its cruel laws and its burning messages, was closing in. Ellie's jaw was set. He looked at the smoke, then at June's face, pale and scared. He knew what he had to do. The line drawn in the dust at the clerk's office was about to be tested by fire. They came at midday, riding slowly up the dirt track towards the ranch, 2 men on horseback. One wore a badge, Sheriff Keller. The other was Calvin Thornton, his brother, the auctioneer, the man who had branded June. They rode with an air of casual authority, as if they owned the land, the air, everything under the sun. Ellie met them in the yard. June stayed inside the house, hidden from view, but Ellie knew she was watching from a window. He stood in front of the porch, rifle leaned against the wall nearby. He didn't offer coffee, didn't offer pleasantries, just waited. Sheriff Keller dismounted first, dusting off his pants. He was a big man with a broad face that seemed perpetually set in a friendly smile, but his eyes held a cold, calculating glint. Calvin Thornton dismounted next, a thinner, sharp-faced man whose smile didn't reach his eyes at all. "Boone," Keller said, his voice smooth, cordial, too cordial. "Heard you had a visitor, a young lady." Illy didn't confirm or deny, just watched them. "Word gets around," Thornton added, his voice lower, edged with steel beneath the polite tone. "Especially when someone takes something that don't belong to him." "She ain't something," Illy said, his voice flat. Thornton's smile didn't waver, but his eyes narrowed slightly. "The law says different. Clerk's office says she's my property. Runaway. And harboring a runaway is against the law. Boone, obstruction, interfering with legal ownership." "She ran from being sold," Illy stated. "Doesn't change the paperwork," Sheriff Keller said, stepping closer. His tone remained friendly, but his eyes were hard. "Look, Illy, we can do this easy. You hand the girl over. No trouble. We forget you interfered. Things go back to how they were." Back to how they were. Eli echoed, the words tasting like ash. He thought of his wife, the fire, the grave. He thought of the ash brand on June's shoulder. You can't keep what doesn't legally belong to you, Thornton said, his voice taking on a harder edge, even if it eats your bread. The implication was clear. He knew Eli had fed her, knew June was inside. It was a veiled threat, a reminder that they knew everything, saw everything. Eli looked at the sheriff, then at Thornton. He saw the entitlement in their eyes, the absolute conviction that they were in the right, because the law said so. He saw the same cruel indifference he'd seen in the auctioneer's face, in the faces in the town store. This wasn't about one girl, it was about power, ownership, control. She stays, Eli said, his voice quiet, firm. Sheriff Keller's smile finally faded, his face hardened. That's a mistake, Eli, a big one. Maybe, Eli replied. He didn't flinch under their gaze. But it's my mistake to make. Thornton stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the butt of the pistol on his hip. Property has a way of finding its way back where it belongs, Boone, one way or another. Eli just looked at him, the silence stretched heavy with unspoken threats. Finally, Sheriff Keller gave a short, sharp nod. They mounted their horses. As they rode away, they didn't look back, but Eli felt their eyes on him even from a distance. They had delivered their message. The easy way was over. Now came the hard way. That night, a storm was gathering in the distance. The air was thick, heavy, charged with anticipation. June sat closer to the fire than usual, sensing the shift, the increased tension. Eli was cleaning his rifle, the rhythmic sound of the cloth on metal, a low whisper in the quiet room. June finally broke the silence. "Why?" she asked, her voice barely audible over the distant rumble of thunder. "Why are you doing this?" Eli stopped cleaning the rifle. He looked at the fire. He hadn't talked about his wife in years, not to anyone. The memories were too sharp, too painful, but June had a right to know, a right to understand the burden he was taking on and why. "Had a wife," he said, his voice rough, measured. "Her name was Sarah." June listened, her eyes fixed on his face. "She was kind," Eli continued, the words coming slowly like stones being pulled from a deep well. "Kinder than this world deserved. She believed in helping folk, no matter who they were." He paused, swallowing. "Couple years back, girl came through. Runaway. From somewhere south." He didn't say property, he didn't need to. June understood. Sarah took her in, gave her food, a place to sleep, said it was the right thing to do. He gripped the rifle tighter. They came for her, the one she belonged to. They came at night. He closed his eyes for a brief moment. Sarah tried to stop him, tried to talk him down, said the girl was just a child. They didn't care. He opened his eyes. They were filled with a pain that went bone deep. They burned the house down with her inside, and the girl. June gasped softly, covering her mouth with her hand. "This," Eli said, gesturing towards the revolver sitting on the shelf. "This was hers." He looked at the gun, the dark metal reflecting the firelight. "She kept it loaded, said you never knew when you might need it, not for killing necessarily, but for standing your ground." He looked back at June. "She gave it to me before. He picked up the rifle again, resuming his cleaning. "That's why I didn't shoot Keller or Thornton today. Not on sight, because Sarah. She wouldn't have wanted that, not first, but she would have wanted this." He gestured vaguely, encompassing the house, the protection, the choice he was making. Protecting what's defenseless, giving him a chance. He didn't say, "I lost my wife protecting a girl, so I have to protect you." It wasn't about some grand, predetermined destiny. It was about a choice, born from grief and guilt and a desperate need to honor a memory. The story of Sarah was a knife in the past, a wound that still bled, but it was also the source of his resolve. It was why the revolver wasn't just a gun, it was a legacy. And it was why he wasn't backing down. Eli took June out to the small, dusty flat behind the barn. He set up a few tin cans on a fallen log. He had the rifle. June had the revolver. The air was still thick with the humidity before the storm, silent and heavy. "Most folks," Eli said, his voice low and steady, "think a gun is about macking holes. Killing something, that ain't it, not really." June watched him, listening intently. She held the revolver awkwardly, her finger outside the trigger guard just as he'd shown her. "You aim not to kill," he said, demonstrating with the rifle, bringing it smoothly to his shoulder, sighting down the barrel. "But to end something, big difference." He fired. The shot cracked the silence. A tin can jumped off the log. "Killin' is easy," Eli said, lowering the rifle. "Ending, that takes thought, takes understanding what you're stopping." He looked at her. "You're not aiming at a person, June. You're aiming at the threat they represent, at the action they're about to take. You shoot to end the threat, to stop the action, to save yourself." He showed her how to hold the revolver properly, how to sight down the short barrel. Her hands were small but steady. He taught her about stance, about breathing. Not just for accuracy, but for control. Control over the weapon, control over her own fear. She fired. The shot was wild, hitting the dirt far from the cans. She flinched at the recoil. "Again," Eli said patiently. "Breathe, sight, end the threat." She fired again, closer this time, then again and again. The tin cans began to dance on the log, knocked over by her shots. She wasn't a natural marksman, not yet, but she was focused, determined. Each shot was a small victory, a reclamation of power that had been systematically denied to her. He wasn't just teaching her how to use a weapon. He was testing her resolve, testing her willingness to fight back. Not just to run or hide, but to stand and face the danger, to take action to protect herself. He watched her face, the concentration etched there, the quiet fierceness that burned brighter than the ash brand on her shoulder. She wasn't flinching as much now. She was steadying herself, aiming, choosing to engage. The tin cans weren't just targets. They were the threats, the pursuers, the system that wanted to take her back. And June, with Sarah's revolver in her hand, was learning how to end them. The test wasn't about hitting the target perfectly. It was about pulling the trigger when it mattered. Word of the sheriff's visit and Eli's refusal to hand over June spread like wildfire through the valley. The situation was escalating. Thornton wasn't just a private citizen anymore. He was the sheriff's brother, with the weight of local authority behind him. Eli's defiance wasn't just against a property owner. It was against the law itself. A few days later, a notice appeared nailed to the post outside the general store. A meeting, an informal gathering of townsfolk and landholders, to discuss the matter of the runaway girl at the Boone place. It wasn't official, but it carried weight, community pressure, the kind that could precede more direct action. Eli didn't attend. He knew what it was, a way to legitimize whatever action they planned to take, to make it seem like the will of the people, not just Thornton's greed and the sheriff's power. But a couple of men, quieter types who weren't fully aligned with the Thorntons, rode out to the ranch afterwards. They reported what happened. The meeting had been tense. Some argued for the law, for property rights. Others, a small hesitant group, spoke of basic human decency, of a child's welfare. But the loudest voices belonged to those who feared disrupting the status quo, who didn't want trouble with the sheriff, or worse, with the Thorntons. Then one man, a rancher named Davies, spoke up, a seemingly kindly old fellow. "Look," he'd said, "trouble's common for that girl at Boone's place, and for Eli if he keeps her. Maybe we can avoid all that." He cleared his throat. "I'd be willing to buy the girl, pay Mr. Thornton a fair price, keep her here out of trouble, see she's looked after. It's the Christian thing to do. Buy her, to keep her safe." Eli heard the words reported by the quiet ranchers, and a cold fury washed over him. Buy her like a sack of feed, like a replacement fence post. Even in kindness they saw property. Davies wasn't evil, perhaps just practical, believing that ownership was the only path to safety in this world. Eli had almost drawn his rifle right there in the yard, hearing the report. The instinct was primal, to shoot the man who saw June as a transaction. The meeting had ended without a formal vote, but the consensus was clear. The pressure was on Eli. Give her back, or sell her. Return her to the system one way or another. His defiance had become a public problem. The world was telling him he couldn't keep what didn't belong to him. But Eli looked at June, practicing her aim with the revolver behind the barn, and knew she didn't belong to anyone. Not anymore. And he would sooner burn this ranch to the ground than let them take her. The storm that had been threatening for days finally broke over the valley. Not with rain, but with wind. whipping dust into stinging clouds and howling through the eaves of the old house. The air crackled with static electricity. Inside, the silence was heavy, charged with the knowledge of the coming confrontation. The message from the burning homestead, from the sheriff's visit, from the town meeting, it was all clear. They were coming, and it would be soon. June sat by the hearth, watching the embers glow. Eli was checking his rifle, laying out extra rounds. The revolver lay on the shelf, catching the firelight. June looked at it for a long time. Then slowly she stood up. She walked over to the shelf, picked up the revolver, and walked over to Eli. She held it out to him, but first. "Here," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Eli stopped what he was doing. He looked at the gun, then at her face. There was no fear there now. Not the raw terror of the auction, not the cautious wariness of the first few days. There was something else. Resolve. A quiet strength that had been forged in the crucible of her past and tempered by the fragile safety she had found here. "If they come," she said, her eyes meeting his, unflinching, "I won't run again." The words were simple, profound. She wasn't saying she wasn't scared, she was saying she wouldn't abandon her ground. That the instinct to flee, ingrained through years of persecution, was being replaced by something else. A willingness to stand, to face the threat, to stay with him. Eli took the revolver from her hand. The metal felt warm. He looked at the gun, then at her. He saw not a child, but a survivor, someone who had chosen not just to live, but to stand. To belong somewhere, even if that somewhere was a small, isolated ranch with a broken man. He looked at her face again, saw the quiet determination in her eyes. He understood completely. Running hadn't saved her. Fighting back, standing her ground, that might. He didn't say thank you. Didn't say he was proud of her. Such words were unnecessary. He just looked at her. This girl who had run from an auction and ended up giving back the means of her escape. Then he said, his voice low and rough, a promise made in the face of the rising storm, "Then I'll shoot first." It wasn't a question. It wasn't a declaration of aggression. It was a statement of absolute commitment. If she wouldn't run, he would stand with her. And he would protect her, using whatever means necessary. The revolver was back in his hands, but its true weight was the resolve June had found within herself. The storm passed without breaking into a full downpour, leaving the air clean but still heavy with anticipation. The next morning, under a sky washed in pale gray, Eli rode out towards the edge of the valley. He needed to see, to know. June stayed at the ranch, armed with the rifle now. He didn't have to go far, just past the northern ridge where the land dipped slightly. There it was, or what was left of it, a wagon, smoldering. The wood charred black, the wheels twisted metal. It was the kind of wagon used for transporting goods, or people, like property. He rode closer, circling the wreckage cautiously. No bodies, just ash and twisted metal and tracks. Many tracks, horses, men on foot. They hadn't reached the ranch. They hadn't needed to. This was the final message. This wagon was likely meant to take June, to transport her back to Thornton, back to the auction or whatever fate awaited her there. But it hadn't made it. Someone had intercepted it. Someone who knew what it was for. Someone who wanted to make it clear that June wasn't going anywhere in that wagon. Eli dismounted, walking among the ruins. He saw signs of a brief, brutal struggle, scuff marks in the dirt. A spent shell casing larger than his rifle rounds. Not the sheriff's men then, or not just the sheriff's men. Someone else was involved. Someone who wasn't afraid to engage Thornton's people directly. But the message was clear, regardless of who sent it. They were done with attempts at legal process, with informal meetings, with veiled threats. The sheriff's brother was done waiting. The burned wagon was a sign of impatient, brutal intent. It meant they would come at night, without a wagon, without politeness. They would come to take her by force if necessary. The standoff was over. The fight was about to begin. Eli looked at the smoldering wreckage, then back towards his distant ranch where June waited. The final confrontation was imminent. Dusk fell, thick and quiet. The storm didn't return, but the sky remained overcast, pressing down on the valley. Eli and June waited in the barn. It offered more cover than the house, more escape routes if needed. The air inside smelled of dry hay and nervous horses. Eli had barricaded the doors as best he could, leaving narrow firing slits. He had rifles, extra ammunition. June sat on an upturned crate, the revolver in her lap. She held it steady, her fingers wrapped around the familiar grip. They didn't speak much, just listened. To the wind whispering through the barn walls, to the horses shifting in their stalls, sensing the tension in the air. Every creak of the barn, every distant sound, tightened the knot in June's stomach. But she didn't tremble, not anymore. Eli checked his rifle, his movements calm and deliberate. He glanced at June. Her face was illuminated by the dim light filtering through the cracks in the wood. It was pale but resolute. Scared? Eli asked, his voice quiet, not a challenge, just a question. June took a slow, deep breath. She let it out slowly, the way Eli had taught her when practicing her aim, to control the shot, to control the fear. "I'm not scared," she said. The words weren't bravado, they were a simple statement of fact. "I've been scared before." She had been scared running from the auction, cornered by the crowd. She had been scared sleeping alone in a strange house, the revolver a cold weight beside her. She had been scared hearing the scrape against the wall, facing the unknown in the dark. She had lived with fear for so long it had become a constant companion. This feeling now, the tension and anticipation, was different. It wasn't overwhelming terror, it was readiness. It was a focus that sharpened her senses, not dulled them. Eli looked at her, really looked at her. She wasn't a victim waiting to be saved. She was a survivor preparing to fight. She wasn't running anymore. She was standing and breathing, ready. He felt a quiet sense of affirmation settle in his chest. He wasn't doing this alone, not truly. He had drawn a line in the dust and she had stepped across it, choosing to stand on his side. They waited together in the dark barn, two figures silhouetted against the faint light, breathing in the dusty air, listening for the sound of approaching horses, of men who saw them as property and an obstacle. The storm outside was quiet, but the storm inside the barn, the quiet resolve between them, was building. Dawn broke, pale and hesitant. The sky was still overcast, but the darkness had lifted. Eli and June were still in the barn. They hadn't slept. They had just waited, listened. But the night had remained silent. No horses, no men, no confrontation. Maybe they had seen the light in the windows, the faint glow in the barn, and known they were expected. Maybe they had heard about the burned wagon and decided the price was too high. Or maybe, just maybe, some unseen force had intervened. Some quiet consequence of defiance had given them pause. Eli didn't know. He just knew the night had passed and June was still. Here, they walked out of the barn into the damp morning air. The ranch was quiet, untouched. The silence felt different than before, not heavy with waiting, but empty, like something had been poised to strike and had retreated. June walked to the small rise behind the house where Eli's wife was buried. A simple wooden cross marked the grave. The ground was bare, dry. June knelt beside it. She reached into the pocket of her dress and pulled out something small and green. A tiny, hopeful sprout she had found growing near the barn, pushing up through the hard-packed dirt. She looked at Eli. He knelt beside her. Together, using a small trowel from the shed, they dug a tiny hole next to the grave marker. June carefully placed the sprout in the earth. Eli helped her cup soil around it, pressing gently. It was a small gesture. Insignificant, perhaps, against the vast, indifferent land and the powerful enemies they had made, but it felt important. A quiet act of creation in a place marked by death and loss. She looked at the tiny sprout, then at the grave. "What do we do now?" she asked, her voice quiet, reflecting the stillness of the morning. Eli looked at the small green plant pushing towards the pale light. He looked at the grave of his wife, taken by fire and violence. He looked at June's face, dirt-smudged but resolute. He thought of the ash brand on her shoulder, the symbol of what she had escaped. He thought of the burned wagon, the symbol of the violence they had avoided. He answered, his voice low, grounded, not with grand pronouncements, but with the simple truth of the earth beneath their hands. "We grow something," he said. "Something that don't burn easy." It wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. A beginning built on ash and dust, on loss and fear, but also on trust, on defiance, on a quiet, stubborn hope. A man who had nothing left to lose and a girl who refused to be lost, planting a seed in the hard ground, daring it to grow, daring them to grow.